Smash! Space Marines.
Hey, today we're going to be revisiting my World Eater Terminators by painting them up in 3 different styles. The first will be more of a tribute to the old school Berserkers I grew up with. The second being a 30K rendition. And the third will be more of a modernized color scheme. Each scheme will be relatively intermediate in terms of difficulty. There will be no crazy methods in terms of painting. At worst, there will be a little bit of blending, but that is entirely optional. If you don't feel comfortable with it, that's totally fine. We're all learning at our own pace, but I do encourage you to try out some of these methods to push yourself a little bit further. After all, considering their role on the battlefield, these guys deserve some proper love. But before we get into the painting, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more. And if you really like what you see, consider becoming a channel member. As you can probably guess, this hobby is quite expensive. Just a few bucks a month can really help me out in terms of producing better content, plus you get to see my videos early, and for just a couple bucks extra, you get 2 exclusive videos per month. Alright, enough of that, let's get into the actual paint list, and let's get to painting these dudes up. Let's go. First and foremost, here are all the paints I'll be using for each miniature in this video. A lot of these paints are actually shared between 3 of them, so expect some duplicates. First, we'll be doing the classic Berserker. And to start this guy out, I sprayed him using Vallejo Game Color Gory Red. You could do this via brush, obviously, but we might as well speed up the process of this part of the painting. Once your base coat is applied, we'll go over the entirety of the trim using Rich Gold from Pro Acryl. Retributor Armor could be a fine replacement of this color, if Pro Acryl is a little harder for you to obtain, but if they're available to you, I'd absolutely go for the metallics from Pro Acryl. This color is really striking, but it absolutely needs 2 thin coats to form an opaque finish. It has a relatively good consistency, you only really need a touch of water to really form a good flow. For any areas that I ended up going over the trim onto the base color, I just cleaned up using a little bit more gory red. I really like this color. The glossy finish of the red works well to the early 2000s palette of the World Eaters. I suppose you could use corn red. Corn red is also a great option. I just like how this looks a little bit better. For all the mechanical trim of the miniature, I'm using dark silver. This color typically only needs 1 coat, but you'll probably want to be better safe than sorry by using 2. Not only are we going over these more mechanical areas, but also the chainmail and the vents, as well as the metal for the weapons. For that weird tube I molded in the Kit Bash video, I used Vallejo Model Color Black. I also applied this to the gun, but I'm not really going over that in this video, as I don't really feel like it's necessary. For the loincloth tarp thing, I used a little bit of Incubi Darkness. I wasn't exactly sure what to use for this portion, so I figured a dark teal would actually contrast quite well with the red. Like I mentioned previously, I'm painting up the gun and I'm touching up the little portions of the metallic using more dark silver. If there's one complaint I have about Vallejo's paints, is that sometimes other brands really have trouble adhering to them. This doesn't happen all the time, but if it does, just be sure to add in just a little extra paint over these areas. I'd also be sure to apply the dark silver over the rail spikes on the top of the miniature. I did this off camera, although I did it for the other 2 in the video, so technically it counts. For the skulls, I began by applying some Pro Acryl Warm Brown. Like all pro acryl paints, they remain wet and malleable for much longer than most acrylic colors. Because of this, I began mixing on some dark ivory while the warm brown was still drying. You don't need to do this, but I wanted to have some fun with these colors. I'm just mixing them in and out and picking out the raised areas using more pure dark ivory as the colors dry. I'd also do the same on these little chest tusks. Like I stated previously, if you're not comfortable with blending, you can just use some pallid bone. I actually go over painting skulls in 3 different methods in this video as well, kind of a little bonus, so just stay tuned if you don't want to paint in this way. For the chest tusks, I technically mixed the colors 2-to-1, being dark ivory and warm brown. While it dried, I simply applied some more dark ivory over the raised edges. Alternatively, you could also just paint this using rich gold as well, but I think this just looks a little bit better. Over the spikes on the top of the Terminator, I added on some Pro Acryl copper. Copper arrowheads kind of sound like a weird concept, but I think it looks neato and it adds visual interest. We will now begin shading the metallics. For the gold and the chains on the fist, I'm using Army Painter's Flesh Tone. Be sure to work this into all the nooks and crannies. I don't want to get this on the red, but it's not the end of the world if you have to do a little cleanup. Next, we'll use Pro Acryl's Brown Wash. For this, I'm washing the silvery metallics, the recesses of the red, as well as the recesses of some of the skulls. This being more deeper within the skulls, mostly the eye sockets. And again, it's all good if you use a little bit too much. You can clean up the red pretty easily. Next, we'll begin highlighting the red using Wazdaka Red. Again, ironic, I know that we're not using Corn Red, but I just like Gory Red a little bit better. Like always, I'm making my initial highlight thicker and sketchy. I don't want to go too far with the sketchy highlights that I'm usually doing with my miniatures. I don't want to make them look absurdly battle damaged. Basically, I want to go for the cleaner art style of old while subtly implementing my own style into the scheme. These big pauldrons can take a little bit of time to get the hang of highlighting, but at the same time, I feel like these huge areas are really good for newcomers to learn how to highlight. You have a lot of area to work with, and hell, if you don't get it right the first time, you got plenty of area to keep working through. This is one of those areas that'll really teach you how to use good brush control. It's kind of essential when highlighting between the line of a shaded recess and the base color. For a finishing highlight to the armor, I'm applying Wild Rider Red on the sharpest areas. This really makes the model pop, especially on the helmet. God, that looks ridiculous and awesome at the same time. To finish off the gold trim, I'll be using Bright Gold from Pro Acryl. This color really lives up to its name, and our model looks bold, bright, and shiny once this is done. And already, I'm starting to feel nostalgic. If you wish, you could do a final highlight of silver metallic to the gold, but I feel like this actually looks a little bit more akin to the old school box art without it. Coming back to the loincloth, I highlighted using Cobalite green, and I'd edge highlight using Saberite green. I'd also end up doing this on the weird tassel on his leg. Again, I wasn't sure what to use for the loincloth, but I think this worked out pretty well. For his eyes, I used Procryl Blue. I really like this color. It's very bright, and it makes these beady little eyes really pop out of his greedly mug. As one final highlight, I'm using Vallejo Game Color Metallic Silver all over the silver areas. And I don't mean go over entirely, I just mean go over the sharpest details, and go over a little sketchy on the pikes. Looks really good. A little goes a long way. And with that, our first World Eater is complete. And by God, he is gorgeous. Truly a callback from the past, and he looks incredible in this more modernized armor. I took the liberty of applying a classic World Eaters decal on, as I really wanted to fully cement the scheme that I and many cornflakes have associated with this army for so long. I'm truly happy with this miniature, if you cannot tell. But, moving on to the 30k mini. For this guy, I essentially Zenithal primed by using a base coat of bold titanium white over a dark primer. Of course, I used an airbrush for this. You don't have to do this with an airbrush. I just strongly suggest using one, as it is a good way of making your miniatures go a little bit faster. Once it's dry, we'll be applying Apothecary White over the entirety of the mini. This is a contrast color, but I'd argue this is essentially a shade of sorts. You'll just really want to work this into every little area of the white, and just make sure that it doesn't pool. For his pauldrons, I applied Procryl Blue. Originally for my other miniatures that I've painted using my 30k scheme, I used Celestium Blue, but I think this color matches better. It applies incredibly smoothly over our base coat, and is honestly more lore accurate. For his mask, I applied some burnt red, and I'd actually work a little bit of this into the flesh. I then apply dark worm flesh over his face. We'll be doing a little bit of blender later on with the flesh, but you could do a more simplistic method if you wish. PG flesh exists for a reason. For the loincloth, I got a little lazy and I simply used some brown wash. This looks pretty good in my opinion overall, but if you want to make this portion look more interesting, stay tuned for the third scheme. For the trim of the armor, I decided to use light bronze and Procryl. Again, the color is rather thin, but 2 thin coats will do you just fine. I will say you'll want to be incredibly diligent with the trim, as cleaning up the white of the mini will be a pain in the ass. Honestly, if you're unsuccessful and you don't wipe it away quickly, you might as well just work it into the scheme. Especially if you're painting an army, there's no sense in worrying about every little splotch. Thankfully, this paint is really light, and it dries super slow, so if you're quick about it, just use a wet brush and you should be good to go. Technically, my original color I used for the 30k trim was brass balls from P3, but unfortunately, P3 is damn near impossible to come by. Bright bronze is definitely a much different color, but since I replaced the blue for my scheme, why not change the trim? Once the trim is painted up, I applied some Gore-Grunta fur over all these weird fur patterns on the armor. I don't think World Eaters are known for having fur patterns, but I think the warm brown looks pretty damn good in contrast with the light colors on the model. For the metallic areas, I'm using the exact same color in dark silver as I did for all 3 of these miniatures. This time, however, I'll also be applying it on the receptacle bits of the Chaos tubes, as well as the butcher's nails on his melon. I also realized that I did this off camera, but paint the tubes using a little bit of Black Legion. Here I'm applying dark ivory over the skulls, bones, and little tassel bits. The skulls are technically painted in the same style as the previous model, but we'll do a little bit more to make them stand out for this one. I'd also apply Gorgrunt fur over these tassels, and the ivory will make them pop out a little bit more. For the skulls, as you can see, some are getting the blending method while a couple are only getting painted with dark ivory. Reason being is that the ones mounted on the pikes will have a gorier look. For now, we're going to move on to blending our flesh color. We already have dark flesh applied, but we'll add just a little bit more. This is thinned down a little as I don't want it to be too chunky. Once it's applied, we'll add in some burnt red to the areas surrounding the butcher's nails. While the paint is all wet, we'll add in just a tiny bit of dark flesh over the burnt red and pull the colors downward onto the face. Blending it downward will allow the reddish tone to fade, and once it's applied, we'll paint in some more dark flesh over the highlights of the face to re-establish the flesh tone. I'd also mix just a touch of ivory to the dark flesh on the sharpest highlights of the skin. This might take a couple tries to see the best results. After all, patience is key when it comes to blending, but I find this method to be rather beginner-friendly in terms of blending. We'll be adding some shade to this later on, but if you like how this looks on its own, keep it like this. We'll switch gears to some of the more metallic trim on the model. For these portions, I'm using copper and bronze. The copper I'm using on the pikes once again, and I'll be using the bronze on the crest mounted on the pikes. I don't exactly know what to call this thingy, you get the picture. For the mask, we'll apply some dark silver to the filters, and we'll apply some bronze color to the teeth and the little mouth vent. For a couple of the skulls and the bone decorations, I applied some pallid bone from the army painter. For the skulls on the pikes, I'd paint them using a mix of red tone with a touch of flesh tone from army painter as well. Next, to shade the gold trim as well as the recesses of the blue, I mixed a 2-to-1 black and brown wash from Pro-Acryl. We'll want to carefully wash this as we don't want it to pull into the white too much. We'll be sure to also focus this entirely within the recessed areas if you can help it. We won't have to worry about overspilling too much on the blue, however, as it'll be very easy to clean up. We'll also apply this to the face of the Mini as well. I mostly just added this to add a little bit more gruffness to the flesh. I also neglected to film this apparently, but be sure to re-establish the light bronze on the highlights of the trim once the shade is dry. However, while it's drying, I'll be applying a little highlight to the fur patterns from earlier using just a little bit of dark ivory and warm brown. I'm really only applying this to the fur on the pauldrons, as I kinda neglected to add in that little ivory undercoat that I used for the tassels. And without that, Gore-Grunta leaves kinda this weird undesirable glossy finish. I really don't like it. Now once our wash is fully dry, I'm going to clean up the pauldrons using more blue. Just a little bit to even out the recess shade. Next on the skulls that I use pallid bone on, I am applying a little highlight of more dark ivory to the raised areas. You don't have to do this, but I think this extra mile makes all the difference between looking good and looking great. Now for the white, I'm highlighting using a little bit of ghost gray. I'll be applying this streakily across the entirety of the white sections. This will effectively create strong highlights, scratches, and chips. It might seem a little too stark at first, but it will tone down as it dries. And if you really want to, you can do an additional highlighting of bold titanium white on the very sharpest edges. Personally, for the style I'm going for this miniature, I don't think it's necessary, but if you want to, go right ahead. I'd also like to mention too, for my previous color scheme for painting 30k World Eaters, I ended up using AK Interactive's Rust Streaks as well as Streaking Grime. I didn't do it for this video as I wasn't sure if it would be necessary, but considering I didn't do any extra blood effects for this video, and considering these guys are World Eaters, I'll more than likely do an expansion video for my original blood video, as it is a little dated. This is really what makes the model stand out once we apply our chipping effects. But before we get into that fun stuff, we have to highlight the pauldrons. For this, I'm mixing blue 3:1 with bold titanium white for the initial highlight. Both of these colors are really fun to play with. And once we've established our first highlight, we will apply a 2:1 mix for a sharper edge. The brighter highlights will also be used for any scratches and paint chips as well. Just be sure to flick your brush enough and just create these little patterns. It might take a little bit, but I think it's really easy once you get the hang of it. Once you're satisfied with the highlights, we'll be adding some blood for the blood god on these skulls. This might be better suited for Night Lords, but I think this works plenty fine on World Eaters as their whole gimmick is tearing people apart like tissue paper. That makes sense to me anyway. To finish things up, I'm applying a mix of coal black and warm brown 3:1 to fill in these little scratches over the model. This little detail really makes the miniature stand out. You could also very easily just use dryad bark for this, I just happen to have these colors in closer proximity. And with that, we have an incredibly outstanding model. I truly feel like this color scheme really is one of my favorites in the entire setting. Something about the simplistic scheme really makes it shine amongst the original 18 legions. I'm kinda surprised the World Eaters have this scheme to begin with. It's so undeniably great that it's kinda weird that they changed out of it to begin with. Either way, looks awesome, I'm really proud of this model, and we're moving on to the last one. And admittedly, I consider this one to be the most beginner-friendly of the batch. I hesitate to call this a speed-painted method, as I took a lot of time painting the face in greater detail, but if I didn't do that, yeah, this is absolutely speed-painted. Regardless, I still think he looks amazing. And for our first step, I sprayed him down using bronze. And after it dried, I began applying Flesh Tearer's Red to the main portions of the power armor. At first I wanted to airbrush this as I wanted a smoother finish, but I found that applying this using an actual brush over an airbrush is actually the better method. Had I airbrushed this, I would have had to repaint the bronze by hand, and I think it's a lot easier to just use a contrast color. This way, all I need to do in terms of cleanup is flick small portions of bronze back onto the trim. I got to be a little bit more laissez-faire with my painting in terms of neatness. Moving on, we're doing the metallics, and you get the picture. We're using dark silver again. Gone over it 3 times now, I think you get it. However, on this mini, I ended up painting the power axe using this color as well, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the blade later on. Next, for all the fur pelts and the loincloth, I'm painting him using a mix of dark ivory and warm brown. I've already kind of done this in the previous models, but I just wanted to shake things up in terms of color. And if you want, you can mix and match which colors you use for this portion anyway. Take all these methods and make your own. Once the pelt patterns are dry, I began using a little bit of Gorgrunta mixed with some Black Legion just to shake it up again. I found that the darker fur matches better with the armor. While that dries, I opted to go over the entirety of the armor using a brown wash. I'll do my best to avoid everything else, but we will want to shade every single portion of the power armor. If you wanted to, you could easily do this over everything. I just feel that using a different wash for the weapons would make them stand out a little bit more. The wash in question is black wash, and we're using this on the power axe as well as the vents and limb joints. These joints are already shaded using the brown wash, but I felt like using the black wash would make them stand out just a little bit more. Standing out in terms that I want to go into further detail with them later on. We'll also apply the black wash to the pikes on the back and this mounted marine head. Side note, this is just Celestium Blue over the bronze. I really like how this looks actually. I might try this later on. Like I alluded to earlier in the video, I decided to spice up the loincloth of this marine by adding a World Eaters decal. Well, technically two of them. I wanted to go for ones that were a little bit more illustrated, as I wanted them to look a little bit more ragged on the loincloth. While the varnish is drying with the decals, I'll be picking out the little joints using Black Legion. Again, I'm primarily doing this just to shake things up between each mini. I strongly encourage you to form your own little habits between each of these three methods. I'll also be applying Black Legion to the little teeth all over the model, as well as some of the spikes. Initially, I was just going to paint him using Pallid Bone and Ivory, but I feel with the Black Legion over the bronze, it really ties this guy all together with this kind of dulled down color tone. Coming back to the loincloth, I'm applying some brown wash to not only seal down the decals further, but also blend them into the actual model. I really like this new decal sheet for World Eaters. Initially I was going to use my 30K one, as I haven't brought it out in a while, but it's in storage, this one was closer by, and I think these are actually pretty good for what you're getting. To finish the axe, I used a streaky dry brushing of metallic silver. Can't go wrong with this method, it always looks good. And for the final portion of this mini, I decided to show a more in-depth look at painting the World Eater's flesh. What I had here is basically the exact same method I used for the 30k miniature. However, I decided to go over using peachy flesh for some reason. Once it dried, I just decided to begin picking out the raised edges using dark flesh mixed with a tiny touch of magenta. I diligently apply this over the raised areas, re-establishing the original flesh color of the marine while leaving these dark shades in the recesses. I'd then finish off these highlights by adding a little bit of white to the dark flesh, and I'd focus this on the sharpest edges, especially on the areas like the veins in the brow. After doing so, I'd finish things off with a light shading of Carroburg Crimson to the recesses, just to tie everything together. Again, like I mentioned, if you really wanted to, you could just use peachy flesh over the face if you painted it white or used some ivory. You could call it a full-fledged speed painting method if you did this, but I feel like taking the extra time really makes this guy stand out. With how dull and brutal his armor looks, his face really stands out as a proper centerpiece. But with that, I'm left with 3 amazing looking minis. For such a single-minded army, there really is a lot of ways that you can make these guys look absolutely spectacular. I think each method brings something great to the table. And I'm really proud of each of them, and I really hope you found each method to be helpful to your own World Eaters. Hell, maybe you'll apply all these methods to your army, use them for different units. But I think I've flapped my beak enough for one video. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more if you enjoyed what you saw, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.